Good evening. I'm Bob Horvath. I'm chairman of the board of the Norman Rockwell Museum, and I'm old because John and I have known each other for 50 years, and we met in Mr. Schoonover's studio down in Wilmington. And I have been a long time fan of Frank Schoonover. And if you haven't walked through the show yet, you have a treat. But you also have a double treat tonight because we have Above the Timberline by Greg Manchess. And I guarantee you, when you leave here, you will have sensory overload. But thank you all for being here. This is going to be a wonderful evening, and I can't wait for you to all see the artwork. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you tonight. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator. And as Bob said, we are thrilled to be opening two amazing exhibitions tonight. Frank E. Schoonover, American Visions, and Gregory Manchess, Above the Timberline. And I'd just love to show appreciation for both our Schoonover family and for Greg, just amazing supports in this exhibition process. So congratulations. The beauty of these two exhibitions coming together at the same time is the continuum, because of course, as we know, Frank Schoonover was an extraordinary golden age illustrator. Could pretty much paint anything. Adventure, history, landscapes, I think anything that was put before him, he was truly a master. And that is certainly the case with Greg as well. He's extraordinary as a draftsman. His imagination has no bounds. And the story that is on view is his personal authorship. And as you go through the exhibition, you'll be able to get a sense of the story, which of course is available in a beautiful book that he produced. So with that, I'd just like to take a few minutes to introduce our wonderful guests, the Schoonover family, who are going to be giving us a little background on their reflections on their grandfather and his work. But as you may know, the Norman Rockwell Museum is a comprehensive resource relating to Norman Rockwell and the art of illustration, but also American visual culture and the role of published imagery in society. So we feel we have a very unique and exciting mission, which is quite rare in the museum world. I'd really like to begin by thanking our generous sponsors who have helped to make this exhibition possible, including the Sordoni Foundation, and the Sordonis are with us this evening, and we thank you so much for your help. Andrew and Susan are great collectors and truly love this material in a way that is very inspiring to us, but also the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and Bonhams. Appreciation goes to our many supportive lenders who have graciously made significant artworks available. We have one beautiful Schoonover drawing, which is a student work thanks to Bob Horvath. But all of our lenders have allowed us to bring together about 80 original artworks, and that would not have been possible without them. So I'd just like to quickly name them. Linda L. Bean, the Biggs Museum of American Art, Brandywine River Museum of Art, with very special appreciation to Christine Podmanisky, who's right here in the front. She is an extraordinary curator there who works with the Wyeth collections. And when I went to visit her, she allowed me to see their rather amazing Schoonover collection. And they have been a major lender to this exhibition. So thank you so much, Christine. So good to have you. Also, Ed Burka, Ruli and Stephanie Carpenter, Christchurch Christiana 100, Tom Duffy, Philip Grace, Robert Horvath, the Kelly Collection of American Illustration, the Korshak Collection, the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, Elizabeth and James Marin, Mr. and Mrs. Andrew McGrellis, Chris Savage, Laura and Cortland Schoonover, John Schoonover, Mr. and Mrs. George A. Smith, and the Sordoni Collection of Illustration and Comic Art, as well as Suzanne and Joel Sugg, and the Tower Hill School. So you can see it really takes a village to bring an exhibition together. I want to give special thanks to John Schoonover and Bob Horvath, who were really amazing advisors during the course of this exhibition process. They know the work like no other, Bob knew Schoonover personally, and of course that was a wonderful opportunity to learn more personally what he was like. I'd also like to express appreciation to the Frank E. Schoonover Fund and the artist's grandchildren, Louise Schoonover Smith and George Smith, who's running our PowerPoint tonight, as well as John Schoonover, who's there in the middle, and Cortland, the youngest, I think. You might not be aware, but the Norman Rockwell Museum, thanks to the Schoonovers, is the administrator of the Frank E. Schoonover Catalog Raisonné website. So the family went to rather extraordinary lengths to compile a very beautiful printed catalog raisonné of Schoonover's work, more than 2,000 artworks, which Frank cataloged very carefully himself. But they also created a website, and we are now administrators of that site, and we've been thrilled to keep up with Frank's work and its whereabouts. So if you go to frankschoonover.org, you will be able to look at the many things that are available there. Also, the exhibit, of course, would not be possible without our wonderful director, Laurie Norton-Moffat, whose birthday is today, sorry. And our board of trustees, and our great exhibit team, Martin Mahoney, Jesse Kowalski, Thomas Mesquita, Jana Purdy, Barbara Runback, Joe Tonetti, Venus Van Ness, and Rich Bradway. And Rich actually produced the wonderful video that you will see in the exhibition, both featuring Frank Schoonover's art and Greg Manchez's art. So with that, I want to just introduce our wonderful guest tonight. And Louise, I think, is going to tell you a little bit more about Frank's background specifically, but I get to talk about our talented speakers. Louise Schoonover Smith was born and raised in Delaware, about 45 minutes from her grandparents. She graduated from Tower Hill School in Wilmington, attended Connecticut College for Women, and graduated from the University of Delaware with a degree in political science. After teaching for a year, she married George Smith, and they have 4 children, 2 of whom are here with us this afternoon, Andrew and Allison. Are you? There they are. Great. Oh, good. Welcome. So glad you could be here. After continuing her education at Keene University, Louise taught for 10 years, at which point John, her brother, convinced her to retire to begin compiling a catalog raisonné of their grandfather's work. And this, of course, was a monumental task. Since 1999, Louise has served as the president of the Frank E. Schoonover Fund, and the catalog raisonné was published in 2009. And Louise continues to speak and travel to spread the word about the extraordinary work of Frank Schoonover. John R. Schoonover is the curator and director of Schoonover Studios Limited in Wilmington, Delaware. And in 1969, John opened Schoonover Gallery's frame shop, and in the early 70s, when the historic artist studio block at 1616 North Rodney Street, which had, by the way, been occupied by Schoonover, N.C. Wyeth, Stanley Arthurs, and others, was threatened with demolition, he worked to ensure their survival. Thanks to his efforts in 1979, the building was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and during the 1980s, state and federal grants helped to preserve these historic studios to ensure their renovation. John's gallery, which actually feels, I hope you can visit sometime, it really feels as though Frank Schoonover just got up and left. Really has a tremendous sense of authenticity, and is located in the studio block, number 1 studio, right? Yeah. John's knowledge about his grandfather's art is nothing short of extraordinary. He knows where every single piece of work is and who owns it. And he's also co-author of the Frank E. Schoonover Catalog Raisonné. And the exhibition wouldn't have been possible without him. And he also wrote a really wonderful essay in our catalog. And I hope you will have the opportunity to read that. It really shows the progression of his grandfather's life's work. Cortland Schoonover is a resident of Charlottesville, Virginia, and he's been married to his wonderful wife, Laura, for 36 years. He has had an outstanding career in the consumer electronics industry at Crutchfield Corporation in Charlottesville, which he retired from after 30 years, just recently, last May. He will be kept very busy, however, as the drummer of the Skip Castro Band, which is actually celebrating its 40th anniversary. Corky served on the Board of Trustees for the Frankie Schoonover Catalog Raisonné Project, and we are so happy that he was able to make it this evening. With that, we are all really thrilled that you are here, and thank you so much to the Schoonover family for joining us to share your reflections.
Thank you, Stephanie.
We are so happy and honored to be here. We are so thankful to the Norman Rockwell Museum for deciding to expand their view and their work in illustration and bring other illustrators, major illustrators, in a major way to the museum. We are, now Stephanie didn't thank herself, so I think we ought to give Stephanie a hand. She has really spearheaded this, and of course Andy Sordoni has sponsored it, as well as a number of other people, and we are just so thankful for all those who have participated. And I think what is going to happen now, so you'll know what's going to happen, is you're going to be thinking of questions, because at the end we'll have a little question and answer period. We may answer some of your questions because we've already tried to think of your questions so that we can address certain things you might have come here to find out about Frank Schoonover. We want to share some personal things so that you might get an idea of what kind of a person he really was. He was born, next. You will have to hear me next. George, this is my husband, George. And we should clap for him. Do you mind?
really should.
Just a little clap for him.
I only responded next.
Yes, dear. Frank Schoonover was born in Oxford, New Jersey, where his father worked, and they lived as a family, and he moved to Trenton as a child. But while he was there, he would go up to Bushkill, Pennsylvania. Trenton is, of course, down towards Philadelphia. But Oxford is up sort of in the west, in the beautiful part, not the New Jersey Turnpike. The beautiful part of New Jersey. And he would go up to Bushkill, which is north of that, just north of the Delaware Water Gap, and be with his grandparents, who lived in Bushkill. And he would go out in his canoe, out in the rowboat. He loved the water. His whole idea of adventure started way back then when he was a child in that area. He loved the Delaware River. He loved the water. He loved to fish. His parents wanted him to be a Presbyterian minister, as you may know, and he was going along with it. But when he was a child, he didn't have handhelds, didn't have TV, and so one of the things he would do in the evening was to copy paintings and drawings by Howard Pyle on pieces of paper. And he loved the drawings of Howard Pyle, whom I know all of you in this room know. I don't have to tell you who Howard Pyle is. One day, after he had promised and planned to go to Princeton Seminary to become a good minister, he was reading a newspaper, and he read that Howard Pyle was going to be teaching at Drexel. That was it. Drexel was it. He went to Drexel, became a student, learned all that people have to learn to be an artist, right from the anatomy. And this is a picture. Does anybody see him? Yep. This is one of the pictures you'll see in the exhibit. And this is a student picture done at a summer school. Howard Pyle ran a summer school in Chatsford, and they offered 10 scholarships, as my grandfather used to say. I made it by the skin of my fingernails. And he joined with the other Howard Pyle students, who have sometimes been called the Pyle students, per se, and studied there for 2 years. They used models, and my grandfather, we have a photograph of my grandfather actually modeling for this, and we also have this photograph, which I thought you would enjoy. This is the photograph. Notice my grandfather painting that picture, and next to him Stanley Arthur's painting that picture. And then behind them, a female artist, Sarah Stillwell, and two what we think Pyle children. Here's one thing I noticed about it, and this is just an aside and has nothing to do with my grandfather perhaps, but do you notice who has the umbrellas in the seats? Next. Howard Pyle, of course, had his favorite students, and I do believe from my research that Stanley Arthurs and Frank Schoonover were two of them. And they, to prove that in a way, they were offered studios in Howard Pyle studios. And that's where they began their work. And you can see that Howard Pyle in the middle is having fun with them. Go ahead. The golden age of illustration, maybe 1870, 1930, basically. My grandfather entered into that in 1899 when Howard Pyle got him a commission. And that commission was a Jersey boy in the Revolution. And you can see his painting looked very much like Pyle painting, right? Very much like a Pyle painting. And that was his first one. He was paid $25 a painting. At the time he started that, he decided to number that painting number 1. And he kept it in little diaries about yay big, okay? Meticulous, beautiful. And when we went to do the catalog raisonné, which has been mentioned already, we used these diaries, which now belong to the Delaware Art Museum and the Schoonover Archives. Notice what we can find out from these diaries. Number 1, what book he was illustrating, or what magazine article. The cover, this was a Joan of Arc cover, what?
Which is upstairs.
Which is upstairs, yes. And Gooseberry Spring, which is also upstairs. We found out what days he worked on it. We found out who were his models. He had many, many, many models, especially at the beginning of his career. And what time of day, how many hours in the day he would work. What was the name of the model, and so forth. There we go. These were for a number of years, and then he changed, and I'll show you what he used at the end of his life. It changed. Okay, now this is the Gooseberry Spring, which you can look for. He was also a calligrapher, and he did the calligraphies for some of the books that he illustrated, and this gives you an example of it. Since we're talking about Joan of Arc, we'll talk about this one. And that's the cover, Joan of Arc. Very strong cover. All those Joan of Arc paintings are owned by Tower Hill School in Wilmington, Delaware. If you ever want to go, I'm sure they'd be glad to take you around. Just tell them I sent you. Okay.
Look for your diploma.
My grandfather did not fear things. I don't know that he was fearless, but he was courageous, he was strong, he was forthright, and he was not afraid to tackle a problem. And as you know, at the turn of the century, muckraking was happening. They were finding out who needed to be, say, caught in the act. This was one of the places, and Andy Sordoni knows all about this, and he could stand up here and talk for an entire hour about the area and the coal mines and everything. So do talk to him, because he knows it. But this is what happened. My grandfather went to visit, lived with a mining family, and took photographs. This was kind of the beginning of his photograph period. And then he would notice the difference between the photograph and the painting, which is not really a painting. Is it charcoal? Charcoal, yeah. Okay, so this was to expose the use of children in the mine. This is absolutely beautiful. If you look at the detail in this drawing, and see these were the women in the silk mills, which was another area. The women were being abused. And this called a moment of conversation in the foreman's absence. What does that say? They were allowed to talk, right. In 1903 to 1904, to prove his courageousness, he went on a beautiful, wonderful, and exciting trip to the Hudson Bay area. And in the Hudson Bay area, they got bobsleds and toboggans and backpacks and all the things you have. And Xavier Gill was his guide, and they went about 1,500, 2,000 miles and met all the natives. And this is a picture of his studio with some of the things he brought back. Here's a toboggan, and here are shoes and so forth. When he went to show his sense of humor, you might notice that here is a sign that says HPSA. They're up in Hudson Bay area. What does that mean?
Howard Pyle Student Council.
Yes, indeed. Howard Pyle School of Art. Smiling, he's standing there. A painting tent. Yes, a painting tent. That's where he did his work. That was his studio.
What was the
Because
name of it, though? Wabino.
Wabino. Wabino.
In Ojibwe.
You can tell, most people, when I ask them that, say, oh, that's the outhouse. No. I have no idea what happened then. Notice that he took lantern slides and he took regular film. This would be the photograph, and this then would be the illustration. So you can see that he used photography even at an early time. This was 1905, and he kept using those photographs, 1924. Notice we're up to 1,303 so far. This one, Andy Sordonis. Clarence Mulford was actually going to, actually he was writing a story about a cowboy. And the cowboy was a rough and ready cowboy. He'd been through a lot of pretty nasty events in his life, had, you know, a leg that was kind of shorter than others, than his other leg. And he, this is to say Clarence Mulford, wanted my grandfather to do the illustration for the book. And so my grandfather connected with him and said, well, tell me about this guy. And they said, well, this cowboy kind of walked with a limp. And my grandfather said, did he hop along? Hopalong Cassidy. That was the first Hopalong Cassidy, and this is one of the pictures from that book, okay? Since this is my brother's favorite painting, I had to include it. Ellipse Double Wedding. In 1906, my grandfather moved out of the studio that he was in, Howard Pyle studio, and I'm going to turn it over to John now to let him tell a little bit about the studios.
Thank you, Phibbs. Well, the best news about studios is they're still there after 116 years, and they're open every day to visitors of all kinds and sorts. And there's an inscription on there my grandfather put, moved into the studio March 8th, 1906 from Howard Pyle studio. And what makes it even more gratifying through the struggle to save the studios from literally from a bulldozer about that far away was that effort's being done in a lot of other places. I just got an email from the relatives of the Percy Ivory family. They're going to do that with their with the Percy Ivory estate or studio, and of course the Schoonover studios, as we know them now, they were the Bancroft studios. Bancroft underwrote the initial cost of the studios at $10,000 in 1906. That you also had Wyeth, as Phoebe mentioned, Ashley, Peck, Harvey Dunn, and Stanley Arthurs. An extraordinary group of young illustrators. Studios, Bob, you probably remember they were kind of falling apart a little bit back in the 50s and 60s. And we have 4 owners. That's Granddad's studio there, the original one. They drew straws. And N.C. Wyeth, as you probably can imagine, drew the longest straw, right, Christine? But he deferred to my grandfather, who had done all the legwork with the Bancrofts to get the studio built. So N.C. said, well, Frank, you can have the leeward studio because the west wind hits that studio dead on in the middle of winter, and it's freezing cold there to the point where Harvey Dunn would siphon off all the steam from the radiators back then to make sure that his studio was warm and the rest of them, the heck with it. Remarkable group of men. Now there they are in a more formal state. As for Schoonover, at one point I named this the Rodney Studio, and that's the interior, as again many people will remember, and it's just sort of like it was. Come visit anytime.
I remember one time that my grandfather took me, well, remember, at the end of his life, he was a teacher, and a teacher of art. He had over 604 students, and I can't see you. I don't like to sit down.
No trouble.
Had over 604 students, and here's the way it was. Monday night, Wednesday morning, Wednesday night, Friday night. So you could go even if you worked, and many people did, and then Saturday morning with the children. And so he took me And I was just overcome. Number one, I loved the smell of the studio. It was gorgeous. All those oils, right? All those oils. We just loved it. And it seemed to be hundreds of children, but there really weren't. But he would go from child to child, and he had a way of holding his hand like this, and maybe he'd have a brush in his hand. He'd go, oh, you just need this a little here, a little there. But what he always said about his students was, I'm not trying to teach a person to be a Frank Schoonover. I'm trying to teach a person to develop their own art talent. Corky, you had experience you wanted to share.
Well, just a couple quick comments first. I'm using a cheat sheet. I apologize. And also, Stephanie mentioned I'm the youngest of the 3 siblings. It may not appear that way now, but when we were growing up, it was by enough years that sadly I didn't get a lot of time with our grandfather. But one of the places I got to go to a few times was the studio. And you can imagine as a 6 or 7-year-old what a magical place it was. The artifacts, the toboggan, the snowshoes, the books, the incredible paintings. People gathered around grandfather talking to him, which I realized later in his years was because they so revered him. And as Phoebe already mentioned, the enduring memory I have is of the smell of the studio, the ambiance, the turpentine, the oil paint. It was just remarkable, and I'll always remember it.
Mm-hmm. John, do you have any other comments?
Yes, back to my studio thing, obviously the preservation of the Rockwell studio, also the Pyle studios in Wilmington. So as I say, these are remarkable places of physical buildings, and the architecture tells such a marvelous story. And so that's what's really made me so proud of the studio still being where it is.
Every day my grandfather got up and he dressed in a coat and tie, no matter how hot it was. And he went to that air-conditioned studio and he painted every single day. And then in 1911, he married my angel grandmother. She was amazing. Where would they go on their honeymoon? Do you remember where you went on your honeymoon? Well, my grandfather wanted to write a book or a story about the pirate Jean Lafitte. And he wanted to call it In the Haunts of Jean Lafitte. And so, where did they go on their honeymoon? Louisiana, yeah. And they went, didn't you want to go there on your honeymoon? Yeah. Yeah, have fun in the bayous. So my grandfather sent my grandmother to the library to do the research on Jean Lafitte. And then this is one of the paintings of Jean Lafitte. A couple things I want to point out to you. You know, my grandfather put red in almost every painting, so why don't you check upstairs when you go up to look and see that there is a little bit of red in almost every painting, unless it's a dead-on charcoal or pen and ink. Notice in illustration, you don't want people going off the page. You want people staying on the page. So if you notice these diagonal lines, they just draw you to this pirate. My grandfather actually, this is called a pirogue, and this painting is called In the Pirogue, and it's upstairs. It's a great, great example of how they protected themselves. This was their security. They sent this guy out, and he was looking for anybody who was coming into the lair, the pirate's lair. Grandfather had all these things researched, including the grass. He even photographed the grass so that he would have the exact grass that was in Louisiana. Any questions? Okay.
If I could interject one
Yeah,
thing.
interject.
So my oldest son, who's also named Cortland, my name and our father's name, called me about a month ago and he said, gosh, Dad, I was looking online, I found this story that was written by my great-grandfather in the haunts of Jean Lafitte. Do you know that? And I said, of course, because Jean Lafitte State Park is near New Orleans. And he said, I read it, and it was really thrilling, and I'm really excited. Now I've been doing some more research and remembering that you told me and realizing that he went up the Hudson River twice, and I want to go explore part of that area, and I thought that was really remarkable. So.
One of the most called for paintings for doing advertisements and research on pirates is this painting. I mean, in the world, even from France and so forth, they've contacted us, could they use this image? This is obviously Blackbeard in Smoke and Flame. Here's what's happening. Blackbeard would get these big cauldrons, and he would put all kinds of nasty things, sulfur and all kinds of things that were actually quite poisonous. He would set those afire, and this was down in the hold, so there was not very good air circulation, and all the men had to come down. The last one standing won the game. So guess who was always the last one standing? You bet, because if you weren't, you probably walked the plank, I don't know. Notice once again the red, the central red. A little story about this is when we were thinking about forming a nonprofit corporation, we needed some money as a little feed money. And Bob Wilson was a contractor, would you call him a contractor, builder?
Yeah.
Built many wonderful buildings in Wilmington. In any case, he met with us. John, of course, has all these connections, and we went to the DuPont green room to have lunch. And he was telling me how he felt about this painting. He said, you know, in the construction business, sometimes things get really tough. He said, and this painting is right in front of my desk. And when things get tough, I look up there and I said, they can do it, I can do it. And he gave us $25,000. I loved it. Thank you, grandfather. And we got started on this whole project. Steve Korshak is the owner of this painting. And I would introduce him, but Steve, we just don't have enough time. I would introduce you, but I would let you get up and talk about it. But Steve, can you stand so they will see? Because I want you to ask him about this painting and how he found it. We didn't know where it was. And he can take 15 minutes and regale you with a wonderful story. But of course, to do a catalog raise now, you have to try to find all the paintings. In any case, he knew through his own research, this goes into his collection. He has an absolutely amazing art collection down at his home in Florida. And he wanted this painting. He wanted to find who it was. So we gave him the clues we had. He went searching for a name of Richard Hardy. And finally, by writing letters, getting responses, this is the capsule view of this whole story. He finally found the owner, and through a series of connections and contacts, purchased the painting. And Steve tells me that when this goes to the sci-fi, like Comic-Con, but it's sci-fi con type gatherings, that it is a great hit because this is the Princess of Mars. I'll tell you one more story about this. In the Delaware Art Museum, there are letters, and letters from Edgar Rice Burroughs to my grandfather, and my grandfather to Edgar Rice Burroughs. And my grandfather wanted to know everything about all the people in these books, and he kept writing letters. Tell me about the weapons. Tell me about their belts. Tell me about the clothes. Tell me about all this. And finally, there was a wonderful letter from Edgar Rice Burroughs that said, "Dear Frank, please do not send me any more letters. Just paint the paintings." Okay.
The fortunate thing about the Burroughs stuff now is with Steve finding that, we know where they all are now. The
Yep.
whole set
Yep.
is,
Good
and
point.
we know where to find
We
it.
know where they are, exactly. Okay. I mentioned Bushkill, which was where grandfather's parents lived, and where he eventually bought property up in Bushkill and built this house. And this house was his escape. When you are an illustrator and you have a lot of deadlines, you have to meet them. And it's very difficult work. So what happened was, this was his retreat. And he would go up there. It was right between the little Bushkill and the big Bushkill. And he would go fishing. But he also had to do his work because being an illustrator is a 12-month-a-year job. So he first used an old sawmill as a studio. And he said, the only trouble is it vibrated all the time. It's really hard to paint when the whole place is vibrating. And so finally he built a barn behind his house here that you see. This is quite original. 1914 was the year, and this was probably in the first 5 years or so. This is the big Bushkill. And I remember going up there. Do you have anything to say before we go to the next pictures?
Well, I was just going to mention that I can document twice that I went to Bushkill with grandfather by pictures. Once when I was about 6, and there's a great picture of my father and I fishing off a rock called Indian Rock, which is across from the sandy beach that grandfather liked to have us canoe to every time that we went up there. And then there's a photo when I'm about 13 or 14, and he's sitting in a canoe, we're at the shore, and I'm holding one end of the canoe. And of course, he's in a white button-down shirt with a tie and his suit pants on, and we're getting ready to take off. But a typical trip involved, the house was declining at that point as it was older. We ate all our meals at Muller's Diner, breakfast, lunch and dinner, and then in between we did canoeing on the Delaware, and it was just, it was fabulous. And he regaled us with stories, taught us things about fishing, taught us how to canoe upriver, showed us how to paddle a canoe, and just learned so much from him.
John?
Well, this is a sad chapter in my grandfather's life because, unlike the studios, this house did succumb to the bulldozer in the Tox Island Dam in the late 60s, and that is recorded and part of a wonderful video that Andy and Susan produced through WVIA in a documentary about my grandfather that called The Authentic Artist, that followed his life all the way into this rather sad chapter, which was right at the end of his life. But the good news was he had painted many of his landscapes of that upper Delaware River Valley, and that body of work, some of which is represented up in the show, is a very important and interesting part of his artistic career, his easel paintings. But 19 acres, house, barn, gazebo, gardens, beautiful gardens, and there's some of the family. It kind of brings a tear to my eye because it's not there.
Mm-hmm. My grandfather and grandmother had two children. One was their daughter. This is taken out in the gardens. She was actually married to this gentleman for a little while, and they were married in the gardens. And our father, Cortland Schoonover, with his mother, circa about 1944, at Bushkill. And this was a look out from the second story of their home. They had a beautiful, beautiful garden. So many plants, so many vegetables, my grandparents there, but it was huge. Now, I will tell you a little story because it tells about how my grandfather saw things. In our work on doing some of the research for the catalog Raisonné, Bruce Smith heard about it, and he contacted us, and we drove up to Connecticut to meet him and heard this story. And he said one day when he was out mowing with the real mower, this lawn, and he was taking a little break, my grandfather came up to him and he said, how are you doing, and so forth, pleasantries. And then he said, Bruce said, what? He said, Bruce, do you see those gladiolas over there? And Bruce said, yeah, I see the gladiolas. He said, do you see the aura of light around each flower? And he said, Bruce looked at me and he said, I never saw the aura, but I knew your grandfather did. And that's why it has such colorful, powerful paintings. Now, another little story. My grandfather thought we all had to learn how to fish. So he got me up one morning when I was up visiting, and he said, okay, it's time to go fishing. And whenever grandfather said, you did. You just did it. That's kind of the way it was. And so he took me to this stream, which is the little Bushkill right behind the house, and I caught a fish. It was wonderful. I was so proud. He was so proud. And I went back in the house. This was before breakfast, mind you. And I came down for breakfast, and there on my plate was a fish, all cooked up. I'd never had a whole fish before in my little life, and I didn't want to eat it. And he said, well, if you're gonna catch it, you're gonna eat it. So eat it I did. And this is one of his canoes, and he was a great canoeist. Okay. One thing about an illustrator, as you know, is they don't tell necessarily in an illustration what happened. You tell just before it happens, because the idea is you want the reader to read the rest of the story. And so this is such a good example. It doesn't happen to be in the exhibit, but it's just a good example of that particular part of illustration. Now, don't you want to know what's going to happen? I do. I guess you'll have to get. It's called Race to the Fire from Smoke. And this one is in the exhibit. Of course, you know George Lucas just bought this painting, and it's sort of the signature painting. Now, don't you want to know what happens to these guys? Look, this guy's chasing him. Look what he's doing to the horse. Do you want to know what happens, or do you want to read it? Okay, tell us. Of course, everybody wants to know. Of course they do. Yeah, he's beating the horse until the horse drops dead. And of course, the good guy catches the bad guy. Now you don't want to read it anymore, do you? See? I told you. Really, I wanted to show you this painting because the grandfather did this series of World War I paintings. Most of them are owned by the Coast Guard. Delaware National Guard, rather. Not the Coast Guard, forget that. Delaware National Guard. And the reason I want to show you this one, and there are a number of them in the whole series, and Gail Hoskins did them also. He and Gail Hoskins did the series for the Ladies' Home Journal. In any case, this is Bruges, and I got a call from the naval base in San Diego, and it was a gentleman who said, I want permission. Being the eldest living grandchild, I have copyright responsibilities, and so he said, I need to have responsibility because I have to have this painting on the front of this book I'm writing. I said, but you're the Navy. He said, yeah, but those are the Marines. That's a connection there. And I said, well, why do you want to use that painting? He said, because it is the only one that I have found that shows this scene with everybody dressed in the correct uniforms, holding the correct weapons. He used many people as models, and this is my father as a model. That's why I happened to put this up. Oh, this is in a series by Louise. This is in a series in Harper's of all of the children's classics, and there's several in the exhibit upstairs. Heidi was in the exhibit. We couldn't find that when we did our catalog raisonné, and it's turned up. We're happy. Yeah. It's upstairs.
It's 100 miles away.
Yeah, it was 100 miles away from us. Christine, it's so hard, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, seriously. Oh, my goodness. It was fun. It was wonderful fun. Corky, tell how you feel about this painting.
Well, this is another one of my enduring memories. When we used to visit grandfather, it was always at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and he would take us out to dinner. But other times we got to visit, we always ate dinner in the dining room. As Phoebe mentioned, he was very formal, not rigid, but formal. And he had his chair at the dining room table, and he always sat in front of this painting. So if you sat across from him, you were looking at this painting the whole time.
As you ate.
As you ate, and it just kind of seared in my memory.
Swiss Family Robinson, another one of those. This is an example that's upstairs, owned by the Aaronsons, Phyllis and Buddy Aaronson. Notice the red. This is a vignette. In addition to being at the end of his life when illustration kind of came to a close, and they weren't sending their oils, still wet sometimes, to the publisher, he branched out into so many different areas. One of the areas he branched out into was designing stained glass windows. Back in those days, if a war hero came home, or if he died, for instance, they would dedicate a window to him. And these are several cartoons of one of grandfather's windows, 17 of which are in the Manual Church on 17th Street in Wilmington, Delaware. His last major work was all in pen and ink. Rifles for Washington, 1938. This one is my painting, and I just happen to like it because my grandfather loved Norman Rockwell and loved the Saturday Evening Post coming to his house. I can remember being at the house, and the Saturday Evening Post came, and he would sit down in his chair with it and he would chuckle and chuckle and chuckle when he looked at usually chuckle. I mean, some of them are more serious, but he just loved them. And I think, really, if you look at, this is called the first typewriter, and if you look at the expressions on the faces, you get the idea, right? Who's not happy? Who's going to be replaced? Who's doing his job? Who's worried about knowing what in the world to do? And who's selling the typewriter, right? This was the day book later. So, for instance, there were 3-ring binders, and this was number 2345. And also important that day was that he caught 7 trout.
9 the next day, no.
Yeah, 20.
It's a good trip.
There you go. So if you can read it. Now, he sold his paintings, and he had a code. O-D-E. If you could break that code, you know how much he sold it for. We've worked on it and worked on
Never
it.
broken.
We don't have any idea. This is R-O-D.
O-O, someone.
So there's a little problem you could get started on tomorrow, whatever. Here's river landscape, okay? And he was still using his numbering system, but kind of got mixed up at this time. So in our catalog, we've had to have like 2045A and so forth. As part of our research, we went up to Linda Bean's house, and this painting was hanging in her house, and it's upstairs. It's one of my favorite paintings. And I loved seeing it at her house, and she was willing to lend it to the museum, and we're so pleased. But it didn't used to look like that. It was the cover for House of the Four Winds. This is a man. See his hand, his arm, his body, and that was his head right there. And grandfather just said to himself, I presume, let's just make this manless. And so he painted over, because in oils, you could do that. You know, it was still your work, and you could make it anything you wanted to. And so take a look at it upstairs, one of my favorites.
The book's up there, too, you'll see.
The book's up there, a number of wonderful things. They have done such a beautiful job with this exhibit. Oh my goodness, wonderful. As part of one of the other things that he did, he made his own Christmas cards almost every year. This, of course, is the Delaware River, once again, Bushkill. We would go down and we would get the rowboat or the canoe, and we would go over to Sandy Beach and go swimming and take a picnic. And it was just a wonderful time. And seeing grandfather work the current, because you know the Delaware River doesn't stand still. It's going and going. And to see him work that current, especially coming back, was a sight to behold. The colors here, he was a romantic realist. Rarely is a boat in the painting, but that was the Busy Lou, my aunt's boat. So it made the painting. This, around the corner, is the, oh, I love that. I think I heard somebody go, That's what I do for all my grandfathers. Oh my goodness. I go, oh, I love that. Oh, okay. Remember I showed you in front of the house was a the Bushkill house was a river. This is where it came out. This is the confluence of the Bushkill, the little Bushkill, the big Bushkill with the Delaware River. This is Corky's. This is up the river, up in Mast Hope, if you know where Mast Hope, Pennsylvania is. That's looking downriver from there. And actually, another of my favorite paintings. As my grandfather got older, he became much more what? Impressionistic. And Symphony of Autumn. The light here sends me. That's all I can tell you. I just love it. And it was only with a great deal of trouble that we got the lady to let us take a picture of it.
Number 2508.
This is 2508. So we started with number 1. 2508 is this painting. So to show you his playful side, here's Corky as a young, and Jamie. My aunt Elizabeth, Auntie Biz, had one child, and this is Jamie. But this just shows how my grandfather was loved by children. Of course, obviously by my grandmother, who was just the best wife ever, and holding hands and holding hands. And it's just so sweet. And they have all made their paper hats, and they're all wearing them. It's just that it was a children's activity. It was for everybody. And he was, and that was part of his whimsical, happy self. He loved life. So anyhow, I could keep talking for a long time, but we're going to end it up by saying that he was a teacher. He had, as I said, over 604 students. And this is one of his, this boy and his 2 brothers were students as children. And it's just a beautiful picture of my grandfather, because it just shows how he felt, if you can feel that. I don't know if you can. He was the friend as the teacher. While we were doing the catalog raisonné, we gathered as many of the students as we could gather in the Howard Pyle studio. And they all said, we just love Mr. Schoonover. He was our friend as well as our teacher. There have been a number of exhibits. This exhibit upstairs is probably one of the largest exhibits of Schoonover works that have ever happened. In our catalog raisonné, we have all the exhibitions. And there's only one that had more, and that was when grandfather was alive. And this one happened to be at the Delaware Art Museum, the Brandywine River Museum. And of course you notice Andy and Jamie Wyeth were there and wanted his autograph. It was just a sweet moment.
He was 94. At
Yes.
least 94.
Yes. Yeah.
I forget the date. Leave it.
Okay, and just a few little facts about him. And he died at age 95. He had paintings on his easel most of his, the last 5 or 6 years of his life. There were always paintings up. He was always working on something, even after he had his first strokes. So now, we've shown you a little bit about his life. What questions might you have or comments that you want us to comment about? My great-grandfather was Colonel John, who fought in the Civil War, and that's why he was Colonel John, and he lived in Bushkill and lived at the Peters house at the end of his life in Bushkill, Pennsylvania. I never met him. He died before I came on the scene. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Okay, who else?
11th New Jersey, 2nd Corps,
Volunteers.
Army of the Potomac, Gettysburg. And I was not named after him. I'm the other John Schoonover on my grandmother's side.
The interesting thing is that Colonel John was an adjutant for the obviously the North, being from New Jersey. And at one point, Lincoln showed up at the tent where he was guarding and helping out, and he was freezing cold. And Lincoln gave him a shawl, and that shawl was later given to the Lincoln Club, which my grandfather was president of for a number of years, in Wilmington, Delaware.
Thrilled I am that the Rockwell Museum, which is an extraordinary institution, really a museum, has embraced my grandfather and many other artists, because just a marvelous opportunity. And the amount of work and research that has gone into this is just a tribute to one of America's great illustrators. And I thank you all again
Thank you,
for
Bob and Andy
us
and
being able
Stephanie.
to enjoy it. And then saying, let the show begin. Is that it?
Well, we thank you for your extraordinary work and your guidance and all of the work that you've done to make sure that everybody for the future understands who your grandfather is, and we're very proud to be a part of that. We've got a catalog in the store, and some of them are signed by these wonderful people. So we hope you'll take one home. Christine has a beautiful essay in it, which is so insightful. But we are so thankful for your very personal insights and for all the work you've done on your grandfather's legacy. Thank you so much, and have a great time at the party. It's upstairs, and we hope you'll enjoy the evening and all the original art. Have a great evening. Thank you for coming.